Bonjour et bienvenue à cette troisième journée des Assises. Je suis sûre que vous allez encore une fois avoir une très belle journée riche d'échanges en one-to-one en atelier. Peut-être qu'il y a un peu de fatigue, mais on y va, on continue, on travaille jusqu'au bout. Mais avant de continuer avec les one-to-one, je vous propose un moment de prise d'auteur sur les sujets IA. Vous le savez mieux que nous, le challenge, le défi aujourd'hui, c'est de savoir saisir les opportunités de l'IA tout en maîtrisant la sécurité. Et Netskope nous propose sa propre vision. Donc, je vous demande d'accueillir Sanjay en scène.
Merci. Bonjour. C'est mon plaisir de présenter avec vous à l'ICC au Monaco. Je m'appelle Sanjay et je suis le fondateur et CEO de Netskope. Et je pense que vous pensez, il parle français, vraiment? Mais ce n'est pas un mystère. Je suis né au Canada, je suis canadien et j'ai tout dit le français pour beaucoup de temps. Mais je pense que c'est un bon topic et je parle en anglais. Mais je pense que vous ne savez ce que je dis si je pense en français. All right, so I will move to English now. So I remember maybe 10 years ago, I made a presentation, and at the very end of the presentation, I asked, does anybody have any questions? And somebody put up their hand and they said, Sanjay, good presentation, but I have a question. Who are you? And what do you do? So I thought in the beginning, I will tell you what we do and who we are, and then I will dive right into the presentation. So first of all, I mentioned I am the founder of Netskope. Netskope is a leader in what is called SASE. It is really a focus on how do you, as the world changes to work remote, use cloud, mobile, how do you have a cloud-based edge proxy that has data protection, threat protection, and so on. We're about 3,000 people. We service about a third of the Fortune 100, and we're one of the largest cloud processors in the world. And we have development here in France and throughout the world. So that's a little about us, but I'm going to dive right into the topic that we have today. So first of all, I don't think you can have any meeting nowadays without somebody saying the word AI. And I remember I actually measured this. Many of you at this conference, perhaps you attend other conferences such as RSA or beyond. And one of the often things I measure is in a meeting, how many minutes does it take before someone asks me about artificial intelligence? So the average, 9 minutes in a meeting before it's brought up. And so in today's world, artificial intelligence is talked about everywhere, right? It's the topic. You could argue it's talked about too much. The reality is 96% of organizations today use generative AI. Now, if you ask me what percent of those organizations use it on purpose, it's a much smaller number. And the reality is, if you look at AI today, it's everywhere. And much like, many of you may remember, 10 years ago, I used to walk into organizations and I would ask them, are you using cloud? Are you using SaaS? And many large financials would say, no, we don't yet. The reality is, when you would actually look into their environment, you would see they have thousands of cloud apps. Why? They were brought in by end users, brought in by business units. IT did not control who could use cloud or not when it started. Same thing with generative AI. And we're going to talk about how AI and generative AI are an unstoppable force that you cannot stop from coming into your organization, nor would you want to. So before I talk about this, when we talk about securing AI, it is very important to understand that all the hype is on generative AI. But the reality is that AI is much broader than generative AI. In fact, as I'll show you, AI is 80 years old. People were building neural networks a long time ago. And many of the great uses of artificial intelligence are actually not generative AI, right? They're leveraging AI for other purposes, data protection, threat protection, behavior analysis. These are neural networks. But it is important to understand that when we talk about securing AI, we aren't talking just about securing generative AI. So this is the chart. Many of you may be shocked. 80 years. It seems like only in the past 2 years have we been talking about this. But I give you this story. About 7 years ago, we had formed a team at our company, an AI labs team, Netskope AI Labs. They developed neural networks to detect passports, driver's licenses, find malware. Nobody wanted to talk to them, right? We had a whole team working on them. In the past 2 years, it feels like they are the stars. Everybody wants to talk to them. And that's sort of as well how I think about AI as well. It has been around a long time, but now it's come to the light. And so for us, you've seen all of the news, right? You've seen companies trying to block generative AI. You've seen people who have lost their data. Could be data poisoning, right? Could be their LLM was hijacked. Could be a lot of different ways. But you have seen, and I talk to a lot of people in boards, and in a board conversation, often I hear this. A board member asks, so how are we using AI? And perhaps someone asks, well, yeah, of course, we have a strategy, we're going to use it, we know it's a competitive advantage. And then the next question was, no, I asked, how are we using it? And often the question will be, well, actually, no, we block it. And the reality is that, as I mentioned before, blocking it is unfortunately not an option, right? It's something that you do want to enable. But how do you do it securely? And that's the balance. Just like when you enabled cloud in your environment many years ago, work remote, maybe even BYOD, you have this balance. I want to leverage these great technologies, but how do I do it in a secure way so I can let my business units and users innovate? And that's really the challenge. And that's really what we're going to talk about. So when you think about securing the use of AI, many people go straight to technology. They talk about, okay, well, here's the technology I'm going to use to secure it, here's the platform. But the way I like to think about it is in a few buckets. First is the culture. If you're a CISO or a CIO or CEO of a company, you have to think about what kind of culture do I want to enable in my organization. That will dictate what kind of policies you have. That will dictate your technology and architecture. And just as important, privacy, legal, regulatory environments. And I'll talk about this at the end, the good versus bad. I'm never a believer that you want to enable technology that could be used more for bad than good. And so we have to be very careful in how we leverage AI. So first, let's talk about culture. So many of you remember, perhaps 10 years ago, even 5 in some verticals, the security team was known as Dr. No. I remember this. Can we use a mobile device? No. Can we bring our own device? No. Can I leverage this cloud storage application? No. Very quickly changed. And it changed because end users and business units were not going to say no. They were not going to take no. If you said no, they would find a way around it. We saw that with cloud. People said no in many cases, and the companies that had said no were the biggest users of cloud and the most risky cloud apps because all the others were blocked. The same with generative AI and AI. I actually don't think the answer no is an option because people will find a way around it, and we've seen this. And so the answer and the culture that most organizations want to enable is, okay, can I use generative AI? Can I use AI? Answer is yes, you can. And here's the guardrails. That's the type of culture that we see organizations enabling. And that's really, when you think about securing AI, I think it starts with that culture. Agreement in the company that, okay, this is our culture for the use of AI. We're going to say, yes, you can use it, and here's the guardrails. And so securing it is about figuring out what those guardrails are. And so when you figure out what they are, it isn't actually just the decision of the CIO or the CISO, right? You have your different marketing units, customer service units, manufacturing groups. They're leveraging AI, right? They're building agents. You have software that's coming in with co-pilots. It really is one of the most important things is to come together when you think about securing AI as a team and to figure out, like, that's the culture I want. Okay, as a group, we want to say yes, and here's the guardrails. And just like we did with SaaS, just like we did when we talked about work remote and direct internet, just like in some organizations, perhaps not in the regulated, super regulated, but in some, how you enabled even people to allow their own devices, especially mobile. So when I think about the 4 pillars of enabling and securing generative AI, the first is understanding, what are you using today? You kind of have to rip the blindfold off to understand, what is my usage today? Because either you have said no or yes, you are using it. 90% of all SaaS in the beginning was shadow. 90+% of all AI usage today is shadow. It is not IT directed or owned or governed. And so the first thing to understand is, well, what am I using? And who's using it? And how are they using it? And what data are they transacting with? What data are they putting in the LLM? What data is in my queries? These are really the 4 steps to understanding, first, what your usage is, and then really how to secure it. And that's what we're going to talk a little about. So before we get into even the next level of detail, there's a very important point when you think about securing AI that you really need to remember, and that is the language. And what do I mean by language? So if you look at the internet today, it's very different than it was 10 years ago. Close to 90% of all internet traffic is encrypted. I remember sitting with the CISO in Germany of a large financial, and he said to me, Sanjay, my privacy team has said I cannot look within encrypted traffic for privacy reasons. And I asked, well, what are you going to do? And he said, well, I got my resignation letter here, I just have to sign it. And the reality is that you cannot have any hope of governing or securing AI without obviously looking within encrypted traffic. Encrypted traffic from your remote users, encrypted traffic when you're on-prem, encrypted traffic that apps have when they talk to other apps. And I know it's a very basic point, but it is very important, obviously, to build an infrastructure, a PKI infrastructure, and beyond, to have high-speed TLS and SSL decryption. So the second big point, when you go beyond taking a look at encrypted traffic, is you have to understand today, unlike 10 years ago, where the majority of internet traffic was web traffic, going to a generic website, the majority of traffic today is going to cloud and generative AI. And so when you look at cloud and generative AI, what is cloud and generative AI when you look under the covers? It's a bunch of APIs and JSON, to be a little technical. The old world was a bunch of HTTP, HTTPS put and gets. All of the equipment that you have, all of us had, that's what it was geared for. It was geared for understanding, oh, I understand web, the protocol. I understand when someone's posting or downloading. That's not the language of the internet today. You can't have any hope of understanding how to secure generative AI if you don't understand the language of the internet, which is APIs and JSON. What does that mean? It does mean that you have to relook at your security and network infrastructure. It has to understand the new language of the internet, APIs and JSON. And I'll give you a great example. A lot of people would come to me and say, well, my old policy was I block or I allow. I block ChatGPT or I allow it. I block Gemini or I allow it. I block OneDrive or I allow it. You can't do that anymore, right? You can't go to a business and say, I'm just going to block it all. And you can't also just allow it, because that opens you up to a lot of security concerns. You need to be more granular. And the only way to be more granular is to understand, as traffic is being processed, it at what I call layer 8, and that's the API JSON level. So I know layer 8, there's no layer 8 in OSI if you're from network security. I'm not trying to invent one, but the reality is today internet traffic is all based off APIs and JSON. When you think about zero trust, you think about how that intersects with governing AI, it's really about giving people least privilege access. I'm only going to give them access to what they want. When they ask to get access to ChatGPT, okay, I'll give you access, but I'll only give you access to the corporate version. You can't use a non-corporate version. I'm not going to let you run queries that say, check my source code or check my confidential data. No, you can't do that. And that's really what I mean. If you understand traffic, in your proxy at this layer 8 level and in your other equipment, you'll be able to enforce these type of policies. And this is really what I mean by the intersection of AI and zero trust, is being granular enough to actually have these very specific policies so you don't have to say no. And so I'm going to give you some examples here that hopefully will clarify what this means. So first, visibility. What does visibility mean? So it would be great if in my SOC, I could just see all my generative AI usage. Remote users, on-prem users, apps talking to other apps, devices, right? And this is kind of what you would see. You would see, here's the ranking of applications. You would see, okay, here's the usage over time, how many users are using it. As well, I would love to say which groups are using it. I'd love to have a conversation with my marketing team and sales team to go, look, I see you're using Grammarly. I see you've brought in this other instance, of Gemini, not the corporate version, right? I want to be able to have the visibility, and that's the first part I mentioned of securing AI, is you need a real-time understanding of what the usage is in your company. Because no matter what policies you may have, they're generally not going to be followed, right, in technology that is newer. You'd want to see, where's data flowing? They're using ChatGPT, it's going to a non-corporate instance, what type of data is transacting, right? The same things that perhaps you're used to having for generic web traffic or even SaaS, right? You need this capability as a first step so you understand how is generative AI being used. So when you think about securing generative AI, after you know what people are using, you have to think about it in two ways. What is going in and what's coming out? And so I'm a user, and I use Gemini or ChatGPT or Bard. Well, generally I'm writing a query. Well, what is that query? Right? Well, does that query contain confidential data? Am I somebody who's trying to poison the LLM, trying to get out data that it shouldn't give me? So am I an attacker sitting in front of your interface, maybe that you built with Llama, or maybe something that you're using commercially? Or am I a valid user, and I don't know that I shouldn't be saying, hey, can you format these credit card data in this way for me, right? What are you doing? The other is what's being returned. And I was sitting with a large advertising company, and one of their concerns was, well, Sanjay, my people are using it for creativity, but how do I know what's being returned is actually something I can legally even use? How do I know I own the IP rights to it? How do I even know that the answer given back is actually valid? They're going to use some stat that it gave me, and they're going to put it on a billboard or beyond. They need to check, right? I don't actually know, is this true? So when you look at this, it's the in and the out, and I'll give you some examples. So if you are setting policies, you have a corporate laptop and you have a personal version of, say, ChatGPT. And someone typed in on a corporate laptop, hey, how do I win at blackjack in Monaco? Right? You could argue, well, what's my policy? Well, my policy is, you know what? Corporate laptop, personal version of ChatGPT. I don't want people doing that. You can't use a non-corporate version. You should be able to very easily have a policy that says, look, can't do that. You can't use your personal version on the corporate laptop. Second, says well-attended. Why is Lisa C such a well-attended conference? Corporate version of your LLM and a corporate laptop, right? You should, before you get to technology, you should know, what's my answer? What is the culture I want? Generally, the culture to something like this is, okay, I'm going to allow that. That's a valid query. There's no sensitive data going. Okay, I'll allow people to use my corporate version of ChatGPT, right? Next example, one of the most most queries made in the enterprise by engineers using generative AI. This is the most common query. Can you check my source code? Can you write this for me? Can you X, Y, and Z? Absolutely not, right? Sending your source code into a commercial LLM is a policy that when I work with CIOs and I work governance people, The answer is absolutely not. You need to be able to block this. We're not shutting this down for you, Mr. Engineer, but you can't do this. Can you reformat these credit cards into a table? Okay, no, you can't do that. And that involves knowing what type of data is being sent into this AI tool. You need to know, is it a corporate or personal instance? You need to know what type of data they're transacting with, and you set a policy. And this is what I mean by granular capabilities when you're securing AI. You're not saying no or yes. You're putting guardrails around their usage. You're not letting them use sensitive data. You're not letting them use non-corporate instances, right? You want visibility into it. This one, I personally allow in my company. If they want to write a poem on our corporate LLM, they can do that. And so it really comes down to the culture and the policies that you want to implement as you drive forward with this. So when you think about securing AI, we all are familiar sort of with the traditional equipment. We used to have firewalls, ports, that was the language. We used to have IPSs, UTMs, next-gen firewalls. You know what the language was? Moved to URLs, moved to applications, and just understanding that, okay, that's OneDrive and that's not, that's ChatGPT and not. But the reality is, if you want to implement the culture, which is unstoppable, the yes and culture, you want to govern AI so people can use it, but with guardrails. You can't operate with that type of technology. You need to have something that understands the internet today, which is all APIs and JSON on the wire. All AI on the wire is that. All SaaS on the wire is that. And that's really what we talk about, this concept that you heard about perhaps here called SSE and understanding what a layer 8 proxy is. So with that, I want to touch on the responsible use of AI. So we touched a little about the steps of securing AI, understanding it, making sure you're understanding what's going in and what's coming out, being able to control instances and data so you can have granular policies. The other big piece, though, is how do you, in your organization, as you secure AI, have a policy that ensures that it isn't just, you're not just stopping people based off of, are they transacting in a way with AI that is irresponsible or puts your company at risk? But I'm a big believer that you also need to have a level of thinking about, okay, how do I want to make sure they use it in a responsible way? And what does that mean? Well, first of all, we all know, and you know, that AI will be over time one of the more regulated concepts or technologies we have, right? It's too much of a mystery for people. There's too much data involved for there not to be some type of regulation. And that regulation will always cover what type of data is being used in this LLM to be trained, what type of data can come out. The reality is that framework, in my view, will be changed constantly, will be modified. But it does come down eventually to responsible use of AI. And I did want to touch on an area of responsibility that we often don't talk about, but I think is very important in the world. And so first, I'll tell you a little about how we use AI responsibly. So for us, obviously, we're in the SASE world. We build this solution that governs all internet traffic and on-prem traffic. For us, when we think about using AI, we think about really using it in 4 ways. And 4 ways that we think will help enable this culture of yes and. And so really it comes to the right side. You have the buzzword bingo of the industry, which really, at its core, that buzzword bingo, it's a layer 8 proxy. Web traffic, SaaS traffic, public cloud, GenAI, it's more all now about APIs and JSON. It's really an API JSON proxy, not a web proxy, right? And so when you look at that, there's 4 core areas that we have in our own use of responsible use of AI. The first is what I talked about, enabling the secure adoption of it. Not blocking it, although blocking certain usage of it, but how do you enable an organization to say yes and? So that's one. The second is obviously leveraging AI throughout our platform. Now, I'm not talking about generative AI necessarily, but I'm a big believer that beyond generative AI, convolutional neural networks can be used to advance the efficacy of data protection. How do I find hazed out credit cards? How do I find people trying to exfiltrate data and images? How do I find PE malware? The traditional methods, you need them, but they need to be augmented, in my view, with neural networks. So that's the second one, leveraging it. Third is utilizing it to enable, which is one of the most common use cases for generative AI, is how do I enable, ultimately, people to find data quicker? I know that's a simplification, but that's kind of what people are doing with their co-pilots. How do I quickly get people to the answer? I could be a call center person, I could be a support person. How do I enable them to get data quicker? There's data all over the place. It's not organized as well. So how can I have a front end that enables them to get quicker? That's really the third one. And then the fourth is we can't have 30 co-pilots. And so how do people play nicely? So whatever you choose as your front end, it at its back can have multiple data sources. And so driving open standards around sharing of data so that they all can be used in the back when you use a co-pilot is critical. So at Netskope, we have an AI governance committee and charter. It's made up of all different groups within the company. It's not the job of the security team or the privacy team, in my view, or the CIO to determine what the AI governance is. It's really the job of all of the different constituents in the company to find the right balance that they want of yes and. Yes, you can use it and what kind of guardrails you have. And so for us, we meet every month. We have a charter on how people can responsibly use it. It does get modified based on input we may get and beyond. And so I won't go through the details of this, but having an AI governance committee with representation across the group and with a clear charter to develop, maintain policies, recommend them, manage your risks, and review your risks in a systematic way, and then ensure you're communicating to your entire company very transparently and your customers how you're using it is critical. So I'm a big believer in this slide. We talk about responsible use and we talk about security, but it is very important to understand. One ChatGPT query is the equivalent of 10 Google searches from an energy perspective. You can see the stat on the right. Training one single model is equivalent of the electricity that 1,000 households use in a year. You've seen and may have read people now bringing back decommissioned nuclear reactors to power AI. Or you can read about it. One of the biggest nuclear disasters in the United States is in 3 Mile Island. That nuclear reactor is coming back now to power AI. We have to be careful. Responsible use of AI also means that we have to understand that it is probably the most power-hungry technology we've had ever. And making sure that there's real outcomes, right? Real results, real value is very important. Also, making sure that the backbone of our footprint, our infrastructure, our data centers, our power is being used responsibly is critical for us. And so as part of your charter, I do think you'll also have an obligation to go, hey, you know what? That's actually, we're not going to get much value from that. It sounds cool, it looks good, looks like a good project, but what's the value, right? And what environmental effect are we having on it? So for us, we really focus on using AI in 8 areas. So we talk about securing AI, but the reality is the opposite too. AI can be used to secure you. So you think about data loss. Most of you have a data loss program. You want to prevent exfiltration of credit card data, maybe healthcare data, maybe your design documents, right? Your IP. Data's the new oil. But you know what the #1 way people stole data during the pandemic was? The #1 way they exfiltrated data. It was through virtual whiteboards. Everybody was on Teams and Zoom and they're whiteboarding. How many people actually had the capability to detect, oh yeah, they're trying to put that whiteboard in a personal system, or what's on that whiteboard? The reality is that today, with the tools we have, the traditional methods of using things like OCR and exact data match, the rest, they're not going to cut it to detect this sensitive data. But AI and the use of things like convolutional neural networks, on the opposite side, can be used to help us secure those applications. Same thing from a PE malware. The #1 source of malware is in the cloud. 50% of all malware is delivered from the cloud today. The #1 source of where that is located is Office 365, Adobe, Google, not because they're in any way insecure, just because they're the most popular, and they know you allow it. So how do you detect that use of that malware and the PE malware? So anyways, 8 different areas that we often see from a security perspective. Behavior analysis, you walk around LACCs, you probably see people thinking about behavior analysis and using neural networks to understand what is a deviation from behavior to detect malicious insiders, compromised users. And so on the other side, while we're securing AI, we do have to realize that as we build our products and our solutions, we should be using AI. And for us, when I think about it, it isn't generative AI that actually in many cases delivers this. It's the other form of AI, neural networks. And real efficacy and real models delivering protection using these. This is a great example of how it's used to protect Social Security, credit card, and beyond data. Another example, which is very important, when you train your models, people don't want to give you their data. So how do you balance using AI and then using it securely, right? You don't want to let people put their data in the cloud. You want to train that model on-prem as well. And so, anyways, I hope, I'm not going to catch the rest of these examples, but I hope this very quickly gave you an overview of how to think about securing AI. 1, culture, yes and. That's what ultimately should be your charter, bringing people together across your organization to then figure out what does the next level of that charter look like. Thinking about it as what goes in to AI and what comes out. When it goes in, how do I govern what instances? How do I govern the data? When it comes out, how do I look at what data is coming out? Right? It's a very simple model. There's a lot of detail behind it. But when you think about securing AI, think about it that way. And then the other side, using AI within your organization, right, as a powerful tool to create differentiation. So time is up. It's saying me on the board, but I do want to thank you all for listening. If you do have any questions, perhaps we take them. I don't know if we have time for them. No? No time. Yeah, we have a booth. Okay, you can come there and you can
And
ask.
the French team is there, of
Great.
course.
Beautiful.
So thank you so much. Merci beaucoup.
Merci.
Je vous donne un rendez-vous tout à l'heure à 14h pour la rétex des JO, présentée par Eviden. Merci beaucoup et à tout à l'heure.